Who starts?
So, Michael, you're a staff writer for the New Yorker. Is that right?
That's what I, yes.
Does that stand for Staphylococcus?
Well, which Staphylococcus?
Maybe one that lives on your skin?
Yes. Yeah, I'm a staff writer. For the last couple of years, I've been writing a book about gene editing. It's taking me longer than it takes plates to change mountains.
Gene editing, wasn't that invented in the 1970s?
It was, but I'm slow to these things.
So
and also, it's cool now.
What's made it cool?
You.
No.
So listen, but I don't want to talk about the technical aspects of biology very much for many reasons, including my lack of knowledge. But what I do think is more important, more challenging, is what the landscape of biotechnology is going to look like 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now. I mean, you guys talk about DIY and community, and it's confusing to me to know what you mean. But I will tell you, and this will seem like a weird thing to say, in 1994, a company called Calgene introduced the Flavor Saver tomato. It was the first genetically modified product, and it kind of sucked. I mean, it did one thing well, which was not ripen rapidly, but it sucked, and it went out of business. But it went out of business because it sucked, not because people hated it and picketed the company and thought it was ending the world as we know it. And that interests me because at some point after 1997, half of Americans began to think that this stuff was dangerous. And they still do. No, facts don't matter, as I think we must know. And so I'm kind of looking down the road at the world of genetic editing, and we're all talking about the ability to do things ourselves, or in small communities, or in small labs. Is that going to work? Are some people are going to be delighted, people in this room. A lot of people are going to freak out. What kind of regulation? I know regulation's a bad word here, but there's going to have to be some, because if there isn't some, it's going to be ugly, but I don't know how to do it. Do you? Drew?
What are you really asking?
How are we going to control these freaky people who are editing shit? That's what I'm asking.
I mean, the same way we control Bob Dylan.
Uh-huh. How's that?
The same way we control speech. Same way we control poetry. It's not the framework we've inherited, but if you think of biology as a generative substrate wherein you can implement creative thoughts, there's an infinite number of combinations that can be realized, and so it's an open-ended domain. The language, so my view on things is we exist in a time where a primitive type of press is emerging for translating human intentions into living matter, whether it be original gene editing or fourth generation CRISPR or DNA synthesis. That's a type of press. And then the functionality encoded in DNA getting organized in incrementally better ways is the beginning of a type of language. Language is a system for translating human intentions from one system to another. It could be us using English. It could be me using Python. It can be others using as yet unnamed language for going into a cell.
Keone making dragons.
Sure. And so then the question becomes, how does one govern the press? How does one govern speech? And although we use the label free speech in the United States, that's not exactly what we mean literally. Actually, speech is heavily constrained. The favorite court cases I like are out of Ohio. Jacobellis versus Ohio and Brandenburg versus Ohio, both late 60s cases having to do with obscenity and lawlessness. And so what's interesting about these cases is they don't say in any particular instance this speech is protected speech or not, but rather they create a framework that's distributable and allows for local context to be included in the consideration of whether or not it's okay to go ahead with something. And so I don't mean to be simple-minded about it, but I do think as a point of departure, looking at these two cases in particular is a good way to change thinking, in part because you could say, hey, is what I'm doing with biology likely to be considered obscene? Yes or no? And that's something that can be defined in a particular context. It might be obscene in a laboratory in an academic institution, but not in a community lab, or vice versa. It might be something that incites lawlessness, and you intend it to incite lawlessness, in which case it shouldn't be okay, or
yeah, but that's the problem. I mean, I agree with you, and I think those cases make a lot of sense as reference points, but they talk about spoken language, and this is analogous but somewhat different. So how are we going to deal with those cases both of malevolence and, what worries me more, if anything worries me, error? Because things are going to get fucked up. Things do get fucked up. And that's okay. But when you say, well, let's regulate it in a way that we regulate free speech, so there's a guy I heard in Oakland who's trying to make a dragon. Oh, that was you. Trying to make a dragon. But he might light his lab on fire and kill a lot of people. What do we do? Do we call the police? Do we shut him down? Do we have a tribunal? What? Or do we just say, cool?
What do you do if somebody publishes an article in a magazine and it causes people to go out and cause harm? How do you hold the author of that article accountable?
It depends. But I do think it's worth thinking about holding them accountable if they're purposely trying to cause harm. Okay. And I don't think that's mostly what we're talking about. You know, there are all sorts of ways to kill a lot of people now, and most people don't use them. Nobody's flying over, as far as I know, spreading anthrax around Oakland. I mean, there's zillions of ways.
The last time that happened, it was the Army or the Navy, and it was Serratia marcescens.
Yeah, but I mean, the point is,
minesweeper. Yeah. But actually, it's really interesting. We've just gotten ourselves in a type of local trap, going full Hobbesian, and
neither of us are Hobbesian.
And I think the reasoning here is warping in a self-reflective way, because everything implied by what we've heard previously, and by what I think is represented in a scalable framework of governance that distributes responsibility and accounts for context, is one in which most people wish to do something constructive, and the upside of that is under selection to outweigh what could happen otherwise. So just to say it, let me give a particular example. The internet is likely to work tomorrow. It is likely to be the case that I can send and receive email tomorrow. That's not because computer networks aren't falling apart all the time, the hard drive is crashing, those things are happening, but there's so many collective and individual incentives to keep that system working, because people wish for it to be true, that if the network went down locally, so many people could become local heroes in restoring that capacity, right? So in other words, to say it out loud, the reason the internet will work tomorrow is because most people wish for the internet to work tomorrow. If you want to talk about the bionet or the biosphere, to the extent that we're getting better and better and better at tinkering with biology and inserting our intentions into a biological network, then we have to construct a culture, which I think we inherit to begin with.
We don't inherit it. There have been 2 trillion doses of GMOs consumed by humans. There has never been a single documented case where one has caused harm. Not one case. 46% of Americans do everything they can to avoid them. So I'm not talking about what's right or what we all in this room and in other rational, quasi-rational places think will work, or even what will work, because they work. I'm talking about the way people are going to express themselves and what they're going to think. And all this crap about designer babies is crap, except that people talk about it all the time.
Okay. So can I interpret what you're saying and see if I understand
You can try.
an aspect? It sounds to me like there's a whole bunch of distractions, is what you're saying. And even if we make things incrementally better and distribute them, and what can be realized is more and more actually awesome, these inherited wedge issues or distracting topics will prevent anything super cool from spontaneously coming true?
No, I don't feel that it will. I guess what I feel is we have a chance now. You know, we can't put the toothpaste back in the jar on GMOs, but we're still at a point where society is not totally freaking out. Some people are always going to freak out, and there's nothing you can do about that. But I think we're still at a point where people can be influenced and value this kind of thing. And in particular, some of the stuff I'm writing about in my book are things well known to many of you. The Kevin Esvelt attempt to edit white-footed mice on Nantucket, and the target malaria attempt to edit malarial mosquitoes in Africa. And I've been to Mali, and I've talked to witch doctors there, actual witch doctors, kind of cool. And they hate GMOs, and they spend a lot of their time trying to prevent them from being consumed. And I said, but...
Where does the hate come from?
France, because most of the reason these countries hate things is because their previous colonial folks tell them to hate them. I mean, that's changing a little bit. Do you want to, can I just, let me finish one thing, which is when you talk to these people in Mali about editing millions of mosquitoes, I haven't talked to millions of people there, but I've never found anyone who says, no, we don't want to do that. And I think that's because everyone knows someone who has malaria or died of malaria, and it means something to them. So I do think this is different, and I think this can be built upon, but I think we ought to spend more time trying to figure out how to do that and not wake up in 20 years and have this stupid fucking GMO debate all over again.
Okay, so I'm really excited. Is this on? Can you hear me?
We haven't decided whether to turn your mic on yet.
Can we
Good
get the mic on?
You can have this one if that one doesn't work.
Hello?
Here, come.
Okay, so I'm super stoked because there's two things in life that I'm really excited about, and it's science communication and science. My name's Christina, and you guys are both, you know, a communicator and a scientist. And I feel like one of the big questions that you're asking is, how do we prevent the fear of science in people who don't know science? And it's in the science communicators. It's in our teachers, it's in our journalists, it's in the way that we communicate science to people. Like, when I was in high school, I was learning things that my parents never learned. And it's this fear of the unknown that's propagated, like, within, like, a certain level of years. But then over time, like, you understand it, and it gets better. So, like,
No,
as a science
I agree
journalist,
completely.
it's like, and also as scientists, because we do a terrible job of talking about our science. All we care about is one thing. Anyway, so I feel like it's the science.
If you did a good job, I wouldn't have a job myself. So
Yeah, well, you're welcome.
keep doing badly.
Anyway, I was wondering, I don't know, I'm one of those speakers who now am ranting about things.
No, listen, I'm not negative about this. I think it's a great opportunity. When I was a kid, 700 years ago, we blew stuff up in chemistry class. That was what we did. I'd like to see kids in third grade editing, you know, swapping genes out in planaria or something. I mean, you know, there's just no reason not to be aggressive about teaching young people, but we're not doing that, and I don't think we can wake up in 20 years and suddenly say, wow, we really should have done this. I think this is too big. This is too important. We're talking about controlling life, making life, changing life. It's not like anything we've ever done before.
Okay. Thank you.
Drew, do you have something nasty to say?
No, I sort of feel like, as somebody who's spent a lot of time caught up in these issues, I feel like most of that time has been wasted. And so my suspicion is, outside of a very small number of edge cases, a lot of the conversation could just be skipped and reality could be constructed. And I think the cost of the conversation that happens, which mostly doesn't lead to anything, is an opportunity cost. And it's an opportunity cost in two ways. One, because you spend your time on it, but also because it keeps everybody from acknowledging what might actually change. So I thought Daisy Ginsburg, for example, made a nice observation. She said, is synthetic biology a revolutionary technology that must promise to revolutionize nothing? Or if I would explain it to my mom, I'd say, hey mom, we made the living world fully engineerable, but everything stayed the same. It just doesn't make any sense. And so I think there's a puzzle that arises when, as you just said, we're working towards operational mastery of living matter, would be my words for what you just said. And that's kind of a big deal. So sure, there's a lot of things to talk about, but if you don't allow for the possibility and what seems like the extreme likelihood that many things could change structurally, supply chains could change, power relationships could change. If you don't allow for that possibility and you try and placate the inherited stalled conversations, basically what you're doing is you're propagating status quo power relationships into the future, just ensuring that everything will remain like it was. And so I guess now I worry a little bit, and because I don't know what to do about the worry, I just kind of increasingly say, except for a few edge cases, which I can note, I'd rather just go make things true, including the cultural politics, but not spend too much time trying to make everybody feel happy about it. Because when things actually change, not everybody's going to be happy about it.
I don't care if they feel happy about it. I just don't want them to be irrationally afraid. And I do think there needs to be some preparation. Let me ask you something. Do you think it's a fair analogy, the sort of mainframe to PC revolution, that this is in any way a fair analogy? That we're now, I mean, I don't think you or I or anyone in this room think the future of biology should be controlled by 1,400 people who live in Cambridge, Berkeley, Palo Alto, and a couple other places.
Yeah, so there's two things that are puzzles, right? So by the time you got to homebrew computing, we were, call that 1975, we were 30 years into massive sustained federal investments in compute infrastructure, right? So Texas Instruments goes from being an oil discovery company based on setting off explosions and capturing reflections off the ground to a submarine detecting company, right, for the Navy during Dove 2. And then from that gets some early investments to develop ingots and wafers. And by the time you get to the transistor logic data book of composable logic elements in the early 70s, late 60s, you're many hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more, of public investment in electronics infrastructure and so on and so forth. So that by the time down on the peninsula you get homebrew compute, things are actually composable at a scale that's quite significant. So when Keone's talking earlier today about building a cell, well, guess what? Things are not nearly composable at that scale right now. The fundamental research has not been invested in, whether by companies or philanthropy or governments. So there's a wish there, which I think is well-intentioned, but the sustained investments in getting the engineering infrastructure in place have not been there. And nobody wants to say, yeah, and let's militarize biology like we did with electronics to pay for it. That's a bad idea. So there's a puzzle. The other part of the puzzle, I think, goes back a little bit further and has to do with industrialization. And so for a couple hundred years now, we've been operating in a context where centralized manufacturing and efficiency that results from certain scales of operations has become normal. And with the internet showing up, supply chains that take advantage of that are now going gangbusters. And biology in its current form is growing up in this context. And so if you look at the national strategies coming around how one structures investments in biotech, they're literally given titles. The reports say things like industrialization of biology. Now, the paradox or irony here, or both, is biology in nature is a pre-distributed thing. And so the cliches on Twitter are, oh, no, even though the reports say we're industrializing biology, we really mean to biologize industry. But that's really just something on Twitter. If you look at how the capital's flowing very much into the way of working such that most of the money goes to big fermenters in a few locations. And so I think it would be interesting to say, and maybe this is something that the community labs can pick up, or the dog breeders can pick up, how does one structure flow of capital or resourcing to develop the technical infrastructure supporting distributed biomanufacturing, which happens in nature all over the place, so we have plenty of existence proofs, but we haven't really mapped the leading edge biotechnologies into that domain. So those would be the two puzzles. I don't think we have the infrastructure in place yet, and the way capital flows selects for centralized intensive capacities.
That's what it knows how to select for, but that could change. Do you have a question?
Mike? So speaking of practical things that we could do and probably should do soon, I'm going to use the imperfect analogy of biology as software. Say we have billions of years of source code out there, and it's got tons of vulnerabilities, and it's pretty imperfect. It just kind of runs. Everyone's afraid to touch it. What sorts of strategies can we think of, possibly informed by the biological world, possibly informed by our misadventures in software? What could we do to mitigate the risks? And possibly, maybe this actually dovetails into what you guys were just talking about. Maybe there's a way to say that distributed biological capability is something that we need, specifically to, if I were to take inspiration from the biological world to create a global immune system, or from the software world to be able to deploy hot fixes quickly. What do you guys think in terms of practical things we should do to mitigate whatever damage is going to happen?
Well, one of the things that, even though I'm partly responsible for it, one of the things that worries me is this analogizing. Like, this is a sort of revolutionary new way of looking at things, and we shouldn't just slap on, it's like computer processor or software or any other thing we want, or even biology before. But I really do think I don't see a strategy at all for people to understand what may happen in the not distant future. Even things like releasing a bunch of genetically modified mice on an island, which could get rid of a very significant problem, Lyme disease. It's causing a lot of anxiety. And there's no reason it shouldn't cause a lot of anxiety, because there are many, many examples in history of people introducing species and changing species and screwing things up really badly. But I just don't see anyone talking intelligently. Again, that word regulation is a stupid word, but just a framework, maybe a framework is a better word. How do we make a framework to talk about this stuff? Because I don't see anybody, I'm pointing at you, it's not really your responsibility, but Washington, there's a lot of people in Washington who are afraid. There are people in Washington who think, like, I'm insane to be here because of you. Because they don't think regular people should have the right to do this stuff, because they think someone's going to fuck it up. And nobody has told them that they're the most likely people to cause that problem. But I just really think this is a fundamental problem, even more than the scientific issues that are real. I mean, we have many scientific hurdles before we can do some of the things we're talking about. Drew, Keone?
Yeah, I have a lot to say on that, but maybe Keone, we can hear from you and loop back.
I have a question from the live stream. Someone asks Drew if he'd be interested in having another conversation/debate with Jim Thomas from ETC Group, like the one he had a decade ago at the Long Now Foundation. Would he consider revisiting the predictions they both made 10 years ago to be productive?
Was that Jim who did actually stream that?
Sure, happy to. Jim and I were at a meeting at the Quaker Friends House up in Toronto in December, put on by the World Council of Churches. So it was a 3-day intensive conversation about synthetic biology as it relates to agriculture and food production. ETC, civil society organization, was one of the co-organizers, and you had sort of one representative of all the world's major religions, as well as various native peoples and so on. It was a great conversation and not full agreement, but I learned a lot. And so I'd welcome a debate or any type of conversation with people who have differing views. I learned, for example, from a vanilla farmer in Mexico, how they experienced the rise of synthetic chemistry and artificial vanilla as it relates to the cultivation of vanilla plants in the forest, and how they adapted to that and then returned to what they were doing previously because they realized they valued their relationship with the land more than they valued money. They valued their relationships with each other more than they valued money. And so by learning that, they've done some interesting things. I would also admit to disagreements, right? So one of the points in the room last December in Toronto was a team that wanted to ban gene drives, amplifying genetic cassettes that might be released in the environment. And I was presented with this in the context of a circle of friends, as it were, and I only had to say in response, I hear what you're saying, ban is a strong word, be careful when you use it. I'm interested in perhaps considering banning prayer. And so then we started talking. I said, well, in Quebec, actually, certain types of public prayer have been banned in a particular way. And so it really resonated, and we had a type of disconnect that resulted in a connection. The prior topic, at least my interpretation of the gentleman's question, in part has to do with security and how one approaches a strategy for biology, including a strategy for biosecurity. I look at biology in the abstract as an open distributed network. It's operating on some natural timescale, and things are sharing functions and atoms and information. People can interface with that, and if you're trying to secure a network and some malintentioned actor shows up and wants to cause harm, you don't know where they're going to show up, what they're going to target, and how long you have to respond, whereas they could have taken a very long time to figure out what type of trouble they want to cause. This is not totally dissimilar in the abstract from securing other types of open distributed networks, including computational networks, recognizing the danger of metaphor. If we look at how we approach securing of open distributed networks, it includes significant centralized capacities and knowledge combined with a distribution of capacities such that anybody anywhere could choose to disconnect or reformat or take other types of corrective action. We all can very quickly note that how one reformats one's family doesn't really make much sense, but you could disconnect in certain ways. And so I'd like to see a lot more cluefulness and sustained energy invested in people working together constructively to tackle the puzzle of biosecurity. I think at a public level, once you get up to the centralized powers that be, so to speak, in the public sphere, the government, it's very, very difficult to sustain conversations because of the political liability revealed by Michael's comments, where it's just discomforting to have a conversation admitting that we understand more about life and we're getting better at tinkering with it. And so there's just sustained and increasing political liability anytime somebody in a political position tries to talk out loud about what's happening in biology, and that doesn't serve us anybody well. The other thing that I think is missing from our conversation so far but it's implied in community labs and in everything that's come before us this evening, is what type of society do we want to be part of? Do we want to be part of a society where we are consumers of technologies, where we are subjects of networks and relationships, where we are objects within systems, or do we wish to be part of a society of citizens? And for me, in this context, I don't mean citizens with respect to national immigration status or any of the frothy short time scale politics. I mean citizenship in the context of access to capacities, rights and responsibilities. And to the extent that we can renew a conversation about what it means to be a citizen of a society and what type of society we should be part of, then this allows us to engage in a perhaps more direct and honest way on the topics of how are we going to develop strategy, how are we going to make sure that each of us has the option of flourishing in ways that are meaningful to each other and ourselves. And that seems to be missing, right, in a lot of these conversations, because everybody's caught up in the reactionary politics of safety and normal values and stuff like that.
I would actually disagree and say that when in the context of things like gene drive and gene editing There's more discussion of open science and the role of people, scientists, participants, than there ever has been in science before. It can go a lot further, it should go a lot further, and we shouldn't be fragmenting it into different communities. But I do think that people are talking about this in a way that they haven't before, and I think that should be encouraged.
Kind of on that note, I have a question, because I can't tell you how many times people have talked about Keone as like a bioterrorist, or my family has asked, will Keone make my Alzheimer's medication one day? So how do you communicate, like Drew, your idea of biology being sort of a right of free speech to people who are not even interested in the lab space, so they can't be impacted by the community labs? And do you think it might just die out with older generations being afraid of it? Or do you think it's going to be sustained through younger generations?
It would be awesome if it died out. I'd be happy to die out with it as a sacrifice to have that happen. But I think just as I hate the word science communicator, but I guess I sort of do that for a living. I think it's really important to talk to people honestly. So this is a really exciting field, and all sorts of, we talk about dragons and dodos and curing cancer and getting rid of malaria and all sorts of cool stuff. And I think many of those things, if not all of them, are eventually possible. I think we need to rein in our expectations. I mean, I have been around a while, and reporters, scientists and reporters, often run ahead of reality. And people who don't understand science grasp on to just the latest thing they've heard. So it's really important for, you know, I say this a lot, I talk to scientists a lot. Scientists used to think, and I don't think people in this room, this is a problem for you, but scientists, I think, used to think their job was to be on the bench and do science, and that was enough. And if they were good scientists, that was their job. And I'm sorry to say that is not enough anymore. Not every single person in a lab has to be able to explain to the guy on the corner what his lab does. But if nobody in the lab can talk to anybody outside of it, that lab's just not going to last very long. And you need to have openness, but you also need to have just a little reality. These things, you know, I don't know how many, every single day CRISPR cures another disease. And I think it will cure some diseases, but so far, no disease is cured. But I can show you thousands of things. I mean, literally every day. You probably get it in your Twitter feed. So we need to rein the hysteria in, and we need to rein in the hyper excitement, because when you tell somebody that they're going to cure MS and it doesn't get done really fast, it's really bad. You've lost that person forever. And that's something you can't get back.
I guess I feel still that it's, or I feel increasingly that it's more important to enable people to have the option of learning to do something rather than telling them that something is happening. Oftentimes when we say science literacy, we mean some high priest or priestess of science, whether it be the expert in the community lab or the academic at Cal, you know, deigns to tell the lay public, let me tell you about what I can do and what it means. And that's a weird type of asymmetric literacy, which is somehow very different than when we talk about literacy in say, a human language, which means reading and writing. And so, again, I think so much attention gets spent on the, let's all talk about it,
No, I think for
let's talk
kids-
about it at the expense of investing in figuring out how to practically make it an option for people to actively learn and practice themselves in ways that are meaningful to them.
I was serious. I think every school kid should be working with gene editing by the time they're in fourth
Yeah.
grade. That is how it's going to be less crazy.
I think it's interesting in your question, you inevitably embed a type of worst case scenario. Is the person you sit next to you a terrorist? And how would you know? And what do we do about that is also implied. And here's a puzzle I don't quite know how to reconcile. You know, the reality is there are some things in biology which are edge cases, which are truly bad. And the tools that are being developed make it the case that access to the things that could cause harm and derivatives that can be imagined as being worse, barrier to entries are dropping. And I tend to not worry about Keone, right, or people in the room, but I do tend to worry about nation states. And I think the framework that we inherit from the Nixon administration around the demilitarization of biological technologies is a framework of a generation ago that seems increasingly at risk of being forgotten, how it arose. And then when I take a look at how things are operating internationally, I have further decreasing confidence that we're not stumbling down a path that might inadvertently see a group of people organized under the banner of a nation remilitarizing aspects of biology. And I tend to...
I agree.
And I mean, you've spent time in Moscow and in Rome and other places. When you take a look at things and you try and rein in the hype, what do you think about real concerns, or what, if anything, bothers you? Or do you think concerns around biosecurity? And,
I agree with you completely. I worry a little about Keone just because I know him a little bit. But that isn't the concern. The nation state is a bigger concern, but I also feel that isn't a reason not to go forward with something that is promising, exciting, and also, and I don't say this with great joy, but I don't know of any technology that has ever been developed by humans that hasn't been used and developed and pushed forward unless it was an unsuccessful technology. So I don't think it's even realistic to think about that. And I think we should go forward, and I don't think we should feel anxious. I don't worry about biosecurity unduly, but I think it would be crazy not to think about it, because it's possible to do these things, and it's going to be more possible, and the barrier to entry is lower, but the barrier to entry to figuring out a way to cure different types of cancers is going to be lower too, and that makes me more happy than the other thing makes me anxious.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you that we should have this technology in every school child's curriculum. And I was sitting in the audience thinking that I should give a book on viruses to every sixth grader that I know in order to have more people like that. But I think where you're coming from is that the biohacker community is not going to move forward if we don't acknowledge real risks in this. That is, biology is really possible. It is really, really powerful, where you have all of these cautionary tales of putting a mongoose on Hawaii to control the rats, and now we have a mongoose and rat problem. You have prickly pears going to Australia, and then 10% of the landmass of Australia was covered in prickly pears. For Australians, they had rabbits, they have cane toads, and because of the ability to reproduce, there is real danger here. Now, what happened in the 70s with the early revolution of biotechnology, scientists met in the Silmar and said, here are our rules. We're going to impose rules on ourselves before the federal government comes in and impose rules. So the biohacker community can do that. Here are biohacker ethos that we're imposing on our community before the government comes in.
I don't think that's going to work with this.
First and foremost, thou shalt not engineer a pathogen, something like that.
Yeah, but what about the guys who don't listen to you? I mean, Asilomar, there are people who think it was less successful than other people. It's taken as a sort of religion that how great it was. But I don't think we can have Asilomar now, because this is a distributed technology that's going to become more distributed. And that's good. I mean, I think that's really good. But though I did talk to a really important scientist recently, and I said, what's your biggest fear about this stuff? And he said, my biggest fear is having the President of the United States use the words gene drive. So far he hasn't, so we're good. But I think that's something we haven't even addressed, which is, you put this in the political realm, there's almost no way it's going to come out well. Because nothing, even well-intentioned people don't make a hash of this, and I don't believe this particular administration is well-intentioned. Question?
Hello?
You got it.
So I haven't heard either of you definitively state what the rights and responsibilities of participatory biocitizen should be. And that's kind of the question weighing on my mind is you have the opportunity to kind of say in some kind of realm of the imagination to this room what you truly believe to be the rights and responsibilities of all of us in the room to be participatory biocitizens.
That's a really good question, and Drew would love to answer it. Come on.
So I already answered it, but maybe it was obtuse. Do whatever you want, subject to the following two constraints. Do not be obscene, and do not incite lawlessness that you intend to realize. That would be my version of it, and that is a prototype of a position for discussion and debate.
I believe it or not, I concur. I mean, be mindful of what you're doing and what the implications of what you're doing are, and you'll be good. You'll know it when it kills you.
It's called the Bill of Rights.
Yeah. I think if you start whipping up, all sorts of extra froth, it's going to get complicated. Megan, you can't ask us questions.
Okay, I have two questions. First, have you guys thought about a podcast? It'd be very entertaining.
What's a podcast?
Shut up. You think he's joking? Never mind. Yes. Yeah, we do.
It's been really another active year in terms of articles written about this community very publicly. What type of role should this community have in engaging with those stories? If it's not conversation, is it action? What does that look like? What should their role be as budding biocitizens?
Well, as an elderly journalist, everyone in this room should be talking to the press. You should be talking to the press openly, intelligently, not hyping. Don't talk about what you don't know, but if people don't talk to us, we're going to hear some stuff, but not all stuff, and we're going to get it wrong. And there are some people that suck, but in this particular field, there are a lot of really good journalists. I'm very impressed. Kristen, are you out there? They're just really good people working hard to do a good job. You have to help them. It's simple.
I was so inspired by the wisdom accruing from the community labs as was represented earlier, and I'm very keen to see the practical scaling of that, and so Megan, in response to what you're asking about, I guess I turn to that duet and ask them and others who are on the ground, what would it take to scale the doing of that? Less talk, more doing. And it may be that talking is part of the puzzle, solving the puzzle, I don't know. But talk is cheap. No offense.
It's totally not cheap.
It's cheap.
It's so expensive.
All right, so when the topic of biosecurity came up, multiple times saying I guess I can summarize it. Let's have rules and agreements.
Can you press the button?
Yeah, I'm not hearing you.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
So when the topic of biosecurity came up, I heard multiple times that you can have rules and agreements and hope that people would follow. But I'd love to hear more about engineering solutions, right? I don't want to make yet another computer analogy, but I come from the computer architecture world, and Drew used the analogy of designing reliable computer systems. So, security has been the discipline of computer systems design since the beginning, essentially. I'm just curious to your thoughts of what can we be thinking about in the engineering side. We should do everything you talked about, but I want to hear more about engineering. Let's think discipline about biosecurity as an engineering discipline.
I think there are real solutions, but I don't understand them, and Drew does.
Yeah, Roger Brent wrote an article that got published only on the MIT Library DSpace digital collection under the Synthetic Biology Archive. And it's his thoughts from when he was working in Berkeley about 15 years ago on biosecurity. And the title of the article is approximately Valley of the Shadow of Death. And he starts with the current time, still the current time, and says operationally what we're doing is we're making moves to buy ourselves time such that we can get to the second part of the plan where practically we've secured operational mastery of living matter, such that you have a capacity to, on an agile basis, do better than react to what's being surprise of the day. So just to make it plain, 20 years of political theater carefully orchestrated by the World Health Organization is leading up to the World Health Assembly finally moving to get the last smallpox stocks at CDC and Vector in Siberia destroyed. But most may know, or some may know, that in fall of 2016, David Evans at Alberta and colleagues built a pox virus genome from scratch, horsepox, not smallpox. And the significance of this practically is the detector systems for pox viruses, the therapeutics for pox viruses, the treatments, in other words, and the vaccines for pox viruses have not all been worked around, but could be worked around in a way via synthesis that wasn't so practical previously. How do you deal with that? How do you adjust a big political system at a global level to navigate that? And the answer is, it's hard, and it's probably not possible. So if you live in this future that Roger describes, 15 years ago, he's talking about doing things like every human shall be born with an extra chromosome that's pre-positioning. The technology du jour was RNAi. RNAi loci expressing things targeting the major viral classes for all, typical human pathogens. And so just every kid being born is pre-positioned with a defense system. We'd call it CRISPR today, but whatever. But then other things would have to be addressed. So hidden in the conversation around building cells are some very profound scientific puzzles, which I think make biosecurity in a real framework not possible now. So if you look at the genome minimization efforts, you get to organisms, microbes that have 450 genes, all essential for the reproduction of that organism. Of order 100 of those genes encode functions that nobody knows what they do. And that's been true for 20 years now. And it's not because Clyde Hutchison isn't a really smart geneticist and biochemist, it's because we don't know what they do. And these genes imply that they're physical functions essential for life, and we can't see what the functions are, so we can't figure out what the genes are doing. If you wanted me to develop a biosecurity apparatus that has to be prepared for anything that's showing up, and even in the simplest reproducing systems, I don't know what about a third of the functions are, I'm just necessarily going to be on a reactive footing. So I would say, very practically, from a public health basis, from a biosecurity basis, it would be worth having national laboratory scale efforts that are truly securing the basic scientific understanding of what all these things are, such that we can have a comprehensive description of all the molecules sufficient to get a cell to copy itself. If you begin to get me on that type of platform, then I'm willing to say, yeah, now I could think about security in a slightly different way. Imagine trying to do computer security where you don't know what half the ports are on the network and you can't turn them on or off and you have no idea how they interact with other things, let alone what's inside. It'd just be crazy. So I think there's a science technology side of this that we shouldn't lose sight of. It's equally important to not lose sight of and to think smartly about the human side of it. So for example, one of the things I've heard is when the anthropologists think about human-human networks instantiated through computer networks, humans wish to know who's looking at them. So that feeling you get when you're sitting there and somebody's looking at you and you glance over and they're looking at you. And so the thinking was that when you linked one thing on the net to another thing on the net, to have that link be symmetric, not an asymmetric link. So if Michael linked my web page, I would automatically know that. There would be a backlink instantly promulgated through a symmetric edge web. But we all know that the web that rolled out was asymmetric edge web, that when he links my web page, I have no idea. Now that's interesting because it's easier to implement technically, but it doesn't satisfy this potential human wish, which is, I want to know who's looking at me. This creates a type of vacuum that over time gets filled by things like PageRank and Google and Alphabet or Facebook that in a centralized capacity, practically provide the backlinking. However, that concentration of power is good and bad in other ways, leads to new types of vulnerabilities and so on. This is where I think the thinking about the human relationships to the technologies of biology as it relates to flourishing as citizens and biosecurity and so on. We have examples where we got some things right and then a lot of things not right in electronics and networking. And I don't think it ports exactly. I think your comment about metaphor is totally correct. But it does seem like we could be as smart as we could be, or at least aspire to be as smart as we could be around figuring it out. And you should interpret what I'm saying as, I'm operating at the performance limits of any conversation I've ever had, so I don't have anything more to say, right? And it just means there's a lot of greenfield opportunity for people to contribute.
So Michael, something that you said about so the journalists that we're working with. So a lot of us in the biohacking community have actually been approached by many, many journalists. And we've done them a favor, you know, of talking to them. I mean, we hosted NHK for 4 days. You know, David's been interviewed, Josiah's been interviewed, we've all been interviewed. But they always take the conversation back to the dangerous stuff. They always modulate the conversation. I mean, I think we've all been, Keone's been a victim of this, you know, that the New York Times has, you know, sort of twisted that, and thank God the community has come out in favor of us and said, you know, this is not what they're all about. So how do we control that conversation? Because
you don't, you never will. I mean, you know, I'm not saying that give up, and I'm not saying that stories that sort of focus, it's really easy to write a story saying, you know, Keone or whatever do-it-yourself biologist is on the verge of wiping out a generation of humans. I mean, who doesn't want to do that? We can make a movie out of it. But it's also irresponsible. It's also, you need to lay things out. You need to find, I mean, some journalists are better than others. You need patience. We're not all that smart. And you're just going to have to work with what you have. But if your goal is never to have anyone talk about the potential downsides, then don't read anything, don't talk to anyone, because that will never happen. I mean, I'm telling you honestly.
okay.
But I do think the more open you are, and this is true with all journalism, the more someone tells their story and tells it truly, the better the journalist is going to be able to write what seems to be real.
Oftentimes vacuums tend to get filled, right? So sometimes you have to create a bow wave and push what you care about into the vacuum. So if for example, when we just got hammered over and over and over and over and over again from 03, 04, 05 with WMDs, you know, we had to come up with TMCs, right? Tools of mass construction. You know, actually, no, we don't work on hemorrhagic fevers. We don't work on WMD. We work on tools of mass construction. And that's what, if you want to talk with us, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about TMCs. You know, so.
No, you're totally right. But that's sort of what I mean. Put out the story you want to put out. Don't expect a good journalist to just swallow it, but give the information you want, and if it's useful, it will. I mean, if that is the story, and it is a valuable story, you guys have a crazy good story to tell it. You know, one of the things I've never understood about pharmaceutical companies is why they never fucking talk to journalists. I mean, at this point, I understand it. But they did a lot of cool stuff. There was a lot of discovery, there was a lot of science, and they all acted like, you know, tobacco companies, and as a result, they are viewed that way.
All right, I got a question really quick. I'm sorry. I think we're going to have to end this because we're getting, all right, you want to go? All right. For you first and then me.
Yeah, sorry. I have a quick question. It's not that quick, but I sometimes think these discussions about biosecurity really obscure other very important discussions, and not just the ones that you've been talking about. I think it's guaranteed that these things will become politicized, and I also think that the edits that we choose to make will also become racialized and genderized, and I think our biological technology already shows evidence of that. And I think we have a great tendency to propagate our own desire, our own image of ourselves, and that becomes really problematic in society. So, you know, with your discussion of flourish versus fear, or just go out and make reality and don't talk about it, I really have a lot of concerns about that. And I also ask questions like, as we're asking what's the job of the scientist, I think we also need to become much more interdisciplinary with that. And for example, ask what's the job of an artist in terms of envisioning the future and envisioning the possible kind of things. What are the co-evolutionary factors that result from our own particular desires? And I'd also just put a big advocacy in for multicultural discussions in terms of who's at the table discussing really determines the outcome of what we choose to edit.
Okay, you're right, that wasn't short. But it also wasn't a question. I agree personally with the vast majority of the things you said. Thanks.
Great. All right, I got the last question for you guys. It's the thought that's on everybody's mind. If you could genetically modify yourself, say whatever trait you wanted, the one that you wanted the most, would you do it? And if you could genetically modify your child, or, you know, to be free of disease or something like that, would you do it?
If you're asking would I like my child to be free of disease, yes. If you're asking would I genetically modify, yeah, I wouldn't mind having, like, I wouldn't mind flying. That would be good. Yeah, sure, I would do it if I could do it and there was no downside. There's never no downside. But if there was, if you're being like mystical about it, sure, why not?
Well, what if the downside was the same as like most pharmaceuticals? Some side effects maybe, but like...
Show me the label and I'll tell you. I mean, you know, some side effects are worth having and some aren't. And by the way, this is true of all of this stuff. There's ups and downs and there's risks and benefits. And one of the big things here is we don't really know what the risks and what the benefits of a lot of it is. But if I knew the risks, I could tell you whether I wanted the benefits.
I just think there's so much tendency among people to think about people. And so I find the question kind of boring.
Leave him alone.
Ouch.
Well, I mean, it's a good question, but how about the rest of the planet, you know, and how about our relationships there? So I think it's just natural for people to get caught up in people. And one of the things about biology is most biology is not people.
Yeah.
So I guess I'd wonder how I could morph your question into the question of how do we change our interfaces or relationships with the rest of the living world. And if you tell me what edits to make to do that, then okay.
All right, everybody, let's thank Michael and Drew.